Welcome back to the show today. I want to share today the next part in Dale Carnegie's book, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living. It's a great book. I highly recommend it. It was written decades ago. We've done several broadcasts on this book already, but there's some things that I want to end the series with on this show that I believe will help you put maybe a capstone on some of the from your own worries and your own situation in your own life. So we're going to start on page 84 because we've gone through almost the entire book in the last several shows. So the story picks up. He says, he had a quote in it. He says, "I had the blues because I had no shoes, until upon the street I met a man who had no feet." Let me say it again. "I had the blues because I had no shoes, until upon the street I met a man who had no feet." Think about that a minute. You and I have a tendency to complain. Yeah, I'm talking about you, I'm talking about me. Because maybe we don't have what other people have. But then when you look at people who don't have what you have, it really changes your perspective consistently. In a massive way, actually. Because when you see people that don't have nearly what you have, and they still have a smile on their face, for me, that just blows me away. So maybe you and I have maybe a decision to make, or maybe it's a total mind shift that we have to have in order to really look at people around us that are not as fortunate as us, even though we are not where we really want to be in life. The book says, "I once asked Eddie Rickenbacker, who was the biggest lesson, what was the biggest thing he had learned from drifting about with his companions in life rafts for 21 days, hopelessly lost in the Pacific Ocean." He said, quote, "The biggest lesson I learned from that experience," he said, "was that if you have all the fresh water you want to drink and all the food you want to eat, you ought never to complain about anything." So let me just pause this story. I can't remember the whole backstory behind it, but Eddie and others were stuck in a raft in the middle of the ocean for a very long time. So he realized real quickly that nothing else mattered except food and water. I wonder how many of us, the stuff that we want, I went through that in my own life. I wanted all these things. But in the last year and a half, 2 years, 3 years, all I wanted was really one thing. And you're probably wondering what that one thing is. Well, that one thing is that for my little girl not to have cancer. That is all I wanted ever. So the book continues. The words "think" and "thank" are inscribed in many of the Cromwellian churches of England. These words ought to be inscribed in our hearts too. Think and thank. Think of all we have to be grateful for, and thank God for all our bounty, all the good things. Jonathan Swift, the author says, of Gulliver's Travels, was the most devastating pessimist in English literature. He was so sorry that he had been born, that he had worn black and fasted on his birthdays, yet in his despair, this supreme pessimist of English literature praised the greatest health-giving powers of cheerfulness and happiness. The best doctors in the world, he declared, are Dr. Diet, Dr. Quiet, and Dr. Merriman. Think about that a minute. That he had to decide later in his life that he was more in control over his attitude than an external force was in control over his attitude. One author says, "We seldom think of what we have, but always think of what we lack." Yes, the tendency to seldom think of what we have, but always of what we lack is the greatest tragedy on earth. It has probably caused more misery than all the wars and diseases in history. Think about all the things that you do have. You might not even have much. You might not have $1 million in the bank. I don't have $1 million in the bank. I wish I had $1 million in the bank. I don't have $1 million in the bank. I don't have anywhere close to $1 million in the bank. But when you start looking around you and kind of play a mind game of what if these people are not in your lives, or what if you lost this, does it really matter? Because really the closest people to you are what matters most. And if they're gone, then what do you have left? You have nothing. You have nothing at all. The author continues. He says, it paused John Palmer to turn from a regular guy into an old grouch and almost wrecked his home. I know because he told me so. Mr. Palmer lives, and at least lived back then, in New Jersey. Shortly after I returned from the Army, he said, I started in business for myself. I worked hard day and night, and things were going nicely. Then trouble started. I couldn't get parts and materials, and I was afraid I would have to give up my business. I worried so much that I changed from a regular guy into an old grouch. I became so sour and cross that, well, I didn't know it then, but I now realize that I came very near to losing my happy home. I didn't know it then, he said. I didn't know it then at all. But now I realize, he says, then one day, a young disabled veteran who works for me said, Johnny, you ought to be ashamed of yourself. You take on as if you're the only person in the world with troubles. Suppose you do have to shut up shop for a while. So what? You can start up again when things get normal. You've got a lot to be thankful for. Yet you are always growling, boy, how I wish I were in your shoes. Look at me. I've only got one arm and half my face is shot away, and yet I am not complaining. If you don't stop your growling and grumbling, you will lose not only your business, but also your health, your home, and your friends. Those remarks stopped me dead in my tracks. They made me realize how well off I was. I resolved then and there that I would change and be my old self again, and I did. He decided to look at somebody right next to him and realize that he doesn't have a need to complain at all. He just doesn't have a need to complain. I wonder if you looked at people in your life who are less fortunate than you in a variety of forms, and then you start counting your blessings every day. Logan Smith packed a lot of wisdom into a few words when he said, quote, there are two things to aim at in life. First, to get what you want, and after that, to enjoy it. Only the wisest of mankind achieve the second. What's the second thing? After you get what you have, to enjoy it. You say, well, I don't have much. I don't have fancy cars. I don't have expensive clothes. But maybe you should be thankful for what you do have instead of complaining about what you don't have. So rule 4 in the book is count your blessings and not your troubles. I know it's hard to do. I get it. I've been there. I am there. So the book, How to Stop Worrying by Dale Carnegie, he goes on in chapter 16. He says, find yourself and be yourself. Remember, there is no one else on earth like you. The renowned William James is speaking to a bunch of men who had never found themselves when he declared that the average person develops only 10% of their latent mental abilities. Compared to what we ought to be, he wrote, we are only half awake. We are making use of only a small part of our physical and mental resources, stating the thing broadly. He says that the human individual thus lives far within his limits. He possesses powers of various sorts when he habitually fails to use. You and I have such abilities, he says, so let's not waste a second worrying because we're not like other people. Oh my gosh, I could talk about that for an hour. He says, you are something new in this world. Never before, since the beginning of time, has there ever been anybody exactly like you, and never again, through all the ages to come, will there be anybody exactly like you again. Now, let me just pause and dig into that just a little bit. I'm sure you have wanted to be like other people. Let me give you an example. Internally, I'm a melancholy guy. I'm an easygoing guy, generally speaking. I like peace and harmony. I don't like confrontation. I don't really like to create issues that are going with other people. I don't like to have confrontation between other folks. And then I look at situations of other people who have been generals, or they have been military leaders, and they have these characteristics that I wish I had. But then, this took me a long time to get here, but I realized that I have certain strengths that they don't have, and they have certain strengths that I don't have. So should I discount the strengths that I have? Maybe you're doing the same thing. Maybe you look at other people in your life, and maybe people on TV or in books or in movies or throughout history. I wish I was like them, you would think. But then really, you were created and wired and built and went through certain things in your life to do certain things that only you can do. So don't discount who you are. Leverage that. I told you this story months ago, but one of the reasons why I'm doing these shows is I have a friend named Paul. Paul and I were having lunch one day, and I was sharing with him how I'm trying to touch other people. I'm trying to inspire other people. I'm trying to share stories and concepts that can maybe inspire, give some encouragement. He says, why don't you go on TV? Why don't you go to this particular place and tape programs and get them out in stations around the country? I says, Paul, I've been in sales. I'm an insurance guy. I've been in insurance for 29 years, although I know all this stuff. He says, I think you need to look into it. So the point is, if it wasn't for Paul prodding me to do something that was outside of my comfort zone, but yet in my heart, it was just another form to help people, then maybe, I guarantee you, this would not have been done. So what I'm asking you to do is to maybe look in your own heart. In fact, what some people do is write down their strengths. Don't worry about your weaknesses. Some people teach to have a list of strengths and have a list of weaknesses. I used to teach that. Don't worry about the weaknesses so much. Invest more time in that list of strengths and then find ways to leverage those strengths for the benefit of other people. Let's get back into the book. The author says that you need to be you. You need to be you. He says, be yourself. Act on the sage advice that Irving Berlin gave the late George Gershwin. When Berlin and Gershwin first met, Berlin was famous, but Gershwin was a struggling young composer working for $35 a week in a tin pan alley. Berlin, impressed by Gershwin's ability, offered Gershwin a job at his musical secretary at almost 3 times the salary he was getting. But don't take the job, Berlin advised. If you do, listen, you may develop into a second-rate Berlin. But if you insist on being yourself, someday you'll become a first-rate Gershwin. Gershwin heeded that warning and slowly transformed himself into one of the most significant American composers of his generation. Why? Because he chose to be the best of himself instead of trying to be copied of other people, like I was talking about earlier. That I wanted to be like these great leaders and this and that, having certain characteristics, being overt and in your face. That's not really who I am 80% of the time. So if you choose to leverage your strengths for the benefit of other people, you can be the first-rate number one of you and not some copycat of somebody else. The author goes on. Bob Hope had a similar experience, spent years in a singing and dancing act and got nowhere until he began to wisecrack and be himself. If you don't know Bob Hope, a late comedian, famous for decades. When Gene Autry, again, this book's written a long time ago, so you may not know who that is. He was a cowboy, a movie star, a singer. Gene Autry tried to get rid of his Texas accent and dressed like city boys and claimed he was from New York. People merely laughed behind his back, but when he started twanging his banjo and singing cowboy ballads, Gene Autry started out on a career that made him the world's most popular cowboy, both in pictures and on the radio, when he started being himself. It is really tempting for you and I not to be ourselves because we see other people being successful, so we want to mirror them, when maybe they're just being themselves, hence why they are successful. So when you and I are genuine, when we are transparent, like we should be, people can see that transparency, and with us being ourselves and leveraging our strengths, then success happens with consistency, with tons of hard work, and by the way, falling on your face over and over again, but that's a different show. As Emerson said in his essay called Self-Reliance, quote, "There is a time in every man's education when he arrives at the conviction that envy is ignorance." Listen, that limitation is suicide, that he must take himself for better, for worse, as his portion, that though the wide universe is full of good, no kernel of nourishing corn can come to him, but through his toil bestowed on that plot of ground which is given him to till. The power which resides in him, in his new nature, and none but he knows that which is he can do, and nothing that else that he has tried, until he has tried. Think about that a minute. You and I are wired to do certain things in life. How many thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of people have died without even living their life? I know quite a few of them. They haven't had a chance to live their life, and some of the seniors haven't mastered some of these skills. You know, the old saying that if it's to be, it's up to me. If it's to be, it's up to me. It's the same thing with you. If it's to be, it's up to you to make these things, whatever those things are, those goals and those dreams, a reality in your own life. The late Douglas Malloch said, "If you can't be a pine on the top of the hill, be a scrub in the valley, but be. The best little scrub by the side of the rill, be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a bush, be a bit of the grass, and some highway happier make. If you can't be a muskie, then just be a bass, but the liveliest bass in the lake. We can't all be captains. We've got to be crew. There's something for all of us here. There's no big work to do, and there's lesser to do, and the task we must do is the near. If you can't be a highway, then just be a rail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. It isn't by the size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are." I'll say it multiple times in the show today. Stop trying to be somebody that you're not. Now, I'm not suggesting that you don't read and study the pros and how they do it. I'm not suggesting that, because I do that all the time, and you should too. To master and to read and learn from people that are really good at what they do, and take lessons from some of these folks consistently. But to be mirrors of them is probably not a good thing. So Rule 5 in Dale Carnegie's book, let's not intimidate others. Excuse me, I said that wrong. Let's not imitate others, he says. Let's find ourselves and be ourselves. The greatest psychologist, Alfred Adler, declared that one of the wonder-filled characteristics of the human being is their power to turn a minus into a plus. Think about that a minute. The power to turn a minus to a plus. If you think about, this is going to probably sound crass, but we're not animals. We don't, at least most of us, don't live our lives by instinct. We live our lives by reason, at least some of us, to do the things that we should do. We're not running like how dogs and cats and other animals do. If you and I put more thought into what we're doing consistently every day, the results that we can achieve in a relatively short period of time are extraordinary. I'm a great fan of Tim Ferriss. He wrote the 4-hour work week. It blew my mind. No, I'm not just working 4 hours a week, believe me. But some of the concepts in that book blew my mind considerably, because he opened up an avenue of thought by him learning from very smart people that I've been able to model in my own life and shift some things around that I was able to get more done in less time. What I'm saying is you need to learn from the masters, but take some of those tools and put them in your toolbox, but don't copy everything they do necessarily. There's an interesting story, the author says, of a woman he knew that had done just that. Her name is Thelma Thompson, and she lived at the time in New York. During the war, she said, as she told me of her experience, during the war, my husband was stationed at an Army training camp in New Mexico. I went to live there in order to be near him. I hated the place. I loathed it. I had never been so miserable before in my life. My husband was ordered out on maneuvers in the desert, and I was left in a tiny shack all alone. The heat was 125 degrees in the shade. He says, not a soul to talk to but Mexicans and Indians, and they couldn't speak English. The wind blew nonstop, and all the food I ate and the very air I breathed was filled with sand, she said. I was so utterly wretched, so sorry for myself that I wrote to my parents. I told them I was giving up and coming back home. I said I couldn't stand it one more minute, and I was giving up and coming back right away. My father answered my letter with just two lines that will always sing in my memory, two lines that completely altered my life. He said this: "Two men looked out from prison bars. One saw mud and the other saw stars." Again, two men looked out from prison bars. One saw the mud and the other saw stars. I read those two lines over and over. I was ashamed of myself. I made up my mind I would find out what was good in my present situation. I would look for the stars. I'll tell you flat out, I'm not suggesting to you that this is easy. I'm suggesting to you that this is a total by-the-hour mind shift that I fail at all the time. Yeah, I do. I mess it up all the time because there's some stuff that's going on in my life that I wish I could go back and change. And I think that you're probably in a similar situation, that there are some things in your life that you wish that you could go back and change, but you can't. You wish you could, but you can't. The late William Bothio, author of the 12 Against the Gods, put it like this: "The most important thing in life is not to capitalize on your gains. Any fool can do that. The really important thing is to profit from your losses. That requires intelligence and makes a difference between a man of sense and a fool." You know, it took me a long time to realize that more successful people fail more often than non-successful people. Again, the more successful people fail way more often than unsuccessful people. I thought for probably 20 years that I was a jerk, an idiot, a fool, a failure, because I seemed to fail more times than I succeeded in a variety of things. But I found out as I grow older that the more I fail, and by the way, learn from those failures, the closer I get to success. And that's the same thing for you too. Most people are afraid of failing, so they think that if they fail at something or multiple things, that makes them a failure, when that doesn't make that's not true at all. If you learn from the situations that you fail in. So if you take the ego out of it, think about that. If you take the ego out of the things that you fail at and use those failures or failings as learning tools, you learn from it, you rebuild what you're trying to accomplish, learn from it, and then you take the step up higher. Whereas if you use those things as an emotional anchor in your life, and think because you failed at this certain attempt 5 times means that it's not for you, but you learned each of those 5 times. So actually you've gotten better those 5 times, so you're farther ahead because you chose to keep going no matter what. William James said this: "Our infirmities help us unexpectedly." So if you think about that a minute, if you look at what's going on in your life, the wrong, the bad, the evil, the mistakes, all the things that have potentially stopped you in your tracks don't necessarily have to stop you in your tracks forever. So rule 6 is when fate hands us a lemon, the author says, let's try to make lemonade. You're going to have to remind me of this tomorrow, or maybe even later today, because I struggle with this a lot. I really do. I think you do too, because the tendency for some of us is to look at the glass as half full, or maybe in my case, empty. That's tough. That's an hour-by-hour mind shift. So the book goes on in chapter 18. There's lots more to share, but I'm going to stop the series after this show. We've done several. But you can cure your worry by following some of the tips that I've shared in this series. So let's go through 6 rules before I end the show. Fill your minds with thoughts of peace and courage and health and hope, and because your life are what your thoughts make it. Number 2, let's never try to get even with our enemies, because if we do, we will hurt ourselves far more than we hurt them. Let's do as General Eisenhower does, or did back then. Let's never waste a minute thinking about people we don't like. Ooh, that one hurts. Let's never waste a minute thinking about people we don't like. Number 3, instead of worrying about ingratitude, let's expect it. There's a story, ancient story, where somebody helped 10 people, but only one came back and said thank you. Number 4, count your blessings, not your troubles. Count your blessings, not your troubles. Number 5, let's not intimidate others. Let's find ourselves and be ourselves, for envy is ignorance and imitation is suicide. Number 6, when fate hands us a lemon, let's try to make lemonade. And number 7, let's forget our own unhappiness by trying to create a little happiness for others. When you are good to others, you are best to yourself. So William James said almost the same thing. Faith is one of the forces by which men live, and the total absence of it means collapse. So this book, this great book by Dale Carnegie, How to Stop Worrying and Start Living, I highly recommend that you get a copy of it. It's very inexpensive. But if you read it just once a year, it can radically change your life in a way that can open your eyes to opportunities and relationships that can dramatically change what's happening. My name is John Carver, and I really thank you for watching the show today. We'll be back soon.